space crimes, and
Guns. Lots of guns.
all heading your way tonight on Constructive Interference. So, over the weekend, I got to look at some of the new movie trailers out, Josh, that were coming out, and one of them was the new Star Wars movie, of course. But I also saw a little bit of an article teaser for a new Matrix movie. Did you see that?
I did. I did see that.
Okay. What's your knee jerk reaction when you hear that there's going to be another Matrix movie?
No.
You just blended both references. You just blended the worlds there perfectly. Look at that.
Yeah, I'm good with that. But no, Joel, I mean, the original Matrix came out in 1999, in my opinion, an immortal classic. One of my favorite movies, if not my very favorite movie ever. I love it. I've watched it dozens of times. I looked forward to the day when my kids are old enough to watch it, so I watch it with them. But the sequels, Matrix 2 and 3, were bad. We don't need to go into all the reasons why they're bad, but they were bad.
But there was giant mechs. I mean, spoilers, guys, but yeah, there was giant mechs. I mean, come on.
There were, but that was not... The Matrix was so ripe to be a good trilogy. I was waiting to see Neo assume his role as the one and beat back the machines and liberate humanity, and then they made the second and third ones, and that's totally the opposite of what happened, and it was just awful. And so the idea of them making a fourth movie after the atrocity of the second and third ones does not make me happy. It makes me sad.
Well, maybe there's redemption in there. You know, maybe Keanu comes in and it turns out that he gets back into the Matrix as John Wick, and then all is put right. You know. I mean, that's what I'm going for.
Well, if you're going
here.
for so bad it's good, I mean, there is potential there. I did see the trailer for the new Star Wars movie you mentioned, and I'm thinking as bad as The Last Jedi was, maybe there is some so bad it's good potential here that could be enjoyed. But
Well, yeah, you know, I think we actually had a slightly, just based on what I saw on Facebook, I think I had a slightly different reaction to the trailer for the new Star Wars movie with the Rise of Skywalker, right?
Yeah.
Than you did. And take this, you know, I hated The Last Jedi was atrocious and horrible, but I also didn't like The Force Awakens. I didn't like either of them. My interest in the entire franchise right now is so low that it's just, you know, barely at a murmur. I just can barely even bring myself to spend money on it. But this one, I actually had a slightly different reaction to this one. I thought this one has got potential that the other ones didn't have. And, you know, I have this maybe foolish hope that the rebuke of the Star Wars community and the fanboy groups might have actually resonated somewhere in Disney. I don't know. Because clearly, you know, they've got, in one hand, they've got Marvel that's just continuing to succeed and come up with new awesome stuff. And then they have this, you know, intellectual property in Star Wars that's just failing. And no matter what they do to try to out-woke themselves, they can't seem to get an audience. Mm-hmm. So, hey, maybe they'll learn. Who knows?
I hope so. I mean, I won't say as much as the next guy, but I do like Star Wars, and and I would love
decidedly less than the next guy,
somewhat less than the next guy, but I do like Star Wars, and I would love for there to be good new movies. You know, I thought Rogue One was decent. I enjoyed watching that.
Oh yeah.
And if there were more movies even of that caliber, I mean, I'd go for that. I like space movies. Mm-hmm. Speaking of space.
Indeed, we have a space story for you.
We've had some really shocking developments in space in the last week. Space crime.
Tell us about it.
Space crime has skyrocketed, Joel. You will not believe the statistic. This year, 2019 versus 2018, the rate of space crime has increased by infinity%.
No.
Yes.
I think it's time for Space Force.
Definitely. Obviously we need Space Force. When you have an infinity% increase in the crime rate in a single year, then you definitely need to have some serious intervention going on there. But what happened here is the news came out this week. There was a female astronaut by the name of Anne McClain, and she is suspected of committing the very first crime ever in space when she illegally accessed her estranged spouse's bank account from the ISS. This is a form of bank fraud, identity theft. and she did it from the International Space Station, which makes it a space crime. So what this means is, previous to this, there had been no space crime. No one had ever committed a actual criminal offense from space before, and so our space crime rate now has skyrocketed. Not only that, though, if you look at the statistics here, what's really alarming is that female astronauts are only 10% of all astronauts, and yet they are responsible for 100% of all space crime. 10%
Wow.
committing 100%. That's pretty shocking.
You know, I look forward to the next Gillette ad campaign discussing women and crime, women and space crime. I think that would be a good take for them. So it's just it's a cultural problem that we clearly need to address.
I mean, obviously, yeah. Especially if you consider how many astronauts there actually are. There's only a couple hundred astronauts, and this one now is a criminal. It's quite shocking. But obviously, we're joking here. Obviously, space crime. The fact that it's gone up by infinity percent is because previous to this year there wasn't any, and now there is some. And when you go from 0 to something, that's an infinity percent increase. Also noting that 100% of space crime is carried out by women. Well, we're talking about one woman who did the one crime. Now, it still adds up to 100%, though. And this is interesting. I think this is a joke here, but the actual use of statistics in our advertising and in our political rhetoric is often about that ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a reason. I think Mark Twain, right? There's lies, damn lies, and statistics. There's a reason for that. People can misuse them easily, and there's a lot of categories in which that happens. Perhaps none more so than when it comes to guns. And that's just it's always in the crosshairs in American politics, right? But statistics are wielded like rapiers in the discussion around guns. Although some people have a very clumsy way of doing it, and then others who are very skilled with it are still very dishonest with it in the same ways that you're discussing here. So the context of this discussion about guns usually follows mass shootings, right? Because that is, if it weren't for mass shootings, honestly, guns would probably have pretty well faded into the background by now. But because of this, I don't know if you could call it a surge or an uptick or a swing or whatever in mass shootings as an attention grab for political ends or societal ends or whatever. Now where it's back front and center all the time because you have one of these, and in our generation, every time a tragedy happens, it has to be on the front page everywhere. So that's where the statistics come into play, and you'll start to hear very carefully and, again, sometimes deceitfully worded things to make the point like you're making on space crime.
Carefully curated statistics. Now, when the space crime thing, when I say 100% of space crime is committed by women, that's true, it is. Does that really matter? Does it mean something? Well, no, it doesn't, because I'm giving you that stat without any context.
Right. Right, and as Steven Crowder likes to say, context is more important than content. I'm sure it's not original with him, but he'll appreciate that I, cited him. But no, like there's the stats in this. If you look at it, and if you listen to particularly the obnoxious whining from Democratic candidates, they like to refer to gun crime, gun violence, all these things, and it's twofold, right? They want to turn your attention to guns, but they also don't want to talk about the overall violence problem, right? Because you're separating it into a subcategory, which is, well, we're not talking about violence, we're talking about gun violence. So then, to reduce it to ad absurdum, as you're talking about space crime, right? Suppose we have 0 homicides in the United States next year, and then the following year we have 1, but it's with an assault rifle. It would be accurate for them to say 100% of homicides this year were by assault rifle. Okay, but that doesn't mean anything, as you're talking about. Like, it doesn't mean anything because the overall violence rate is incredibly low. And I think as we run through some of the numbers here tonight, that's hopefully what we're gonna discern about some of these statistics. But if you are not out following us online right now, you really ought to be. Make sure you get out to Twitter, look us up at The CI Show, and on Facebook.com/The CI Show. Gun bans are something that comes up along with mass shootings a lot of the time, and I don't know why anybody thinks that'll work.
Because it's simple and it sounds like sort of like a panacea. You think we can just, obviously, if people don't have guns, then they can't be violent, right? I mean, look at the word. When were guns invented? We're talking like the 1500s roundabout. Like modern muskets, not modern, but the muskets, like Revolutionary War type muskets, were invented. What, the 1650s roundabouts when those became popular?
I want to say it was maybe a little bit before that. No, maybe that's about right. I think that's about right.
And that's when violence came into the world, because we all know that before that. I mean, if you study like history, say for instance in Rome, we know that there was no violence in Rome. We had this guy, Genghis Khan, back before guns, no violence there. We know that the Aztecs,
peaceful dude,
peaceful dude. Yes, we know the Aztecs were not violent people. We know that there was no violence, no murder, and certainly no terrorism prior to the advent of firearms.
Right. I'm running back through my Age of Empires history of the world right now, and I think maybe what you said was a little bit inaccurate.
It might have been a little bit inaccurate. But still, the idea is that when we think of weapons today, our modern weapons are guns. And so we think, well, if we just take away the weapon, then people won't be able to be violent. It's equivalent to someone, 1,000 years ago thinking, well, if we just take away the swords, there'll be no violence. But what I find really interesting is that we talk about mass violence, we talk about mass shootings and how those grab headlines. But if you look at mass killing as a category of violence, and stop thinking about the type of weapon and just think about the victim counts. What types of weapons have we seen get the greatest number of victims in one go in the past few decades? Has it been guns? No, it's been vehicles.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the biggest and most infamous instance of mass killing from recent history was 9/11, when Al-Qaeda terrorists killed around 3,000 Americans. What weapon did they use? Did they use weapons of war, as we consider them? Did they use assault rifles? Did they use RPGs? No, they used vehicles. They used airplanes. We look at another, prior to that, another big terrorist attack was when Timothy McVeigh blew up the Oklahoma City federal government building back in the 90s. What did he use? Did he kill those people with guns? No, he used, again, a vehicle. He had a truck full of fertilizer, basically, of explosives based on fertilizer. We had that incident in Nice, in France, I think back in 2016, where a terrorist killed over 80 people all in one go, and he was using, again, a vehicle, using a truck.
Well, right. The destructive potential is, just pound for pound and moment for moment. I mean, you got to look at the speed. I mean, there's a whole lot of factors that go into somebody whose only motivation is to kill as many people as possible. And by the way, this is something that came up locally here in Des Moines not too long ago, because a city council member who shall not be named, but if you're interested, you can look up the articles that I've posted on that. But he came out and just straight up said, as part of a proposal to ban high capacity magazines, which of course he defined as more than 10, and bump stocks, which are already banned, that nobody could ever want either of those two items except to kill as many people as possible. And so I'm looking at it going, wow, that's not only is that an absurdly insulting statement, but he clearly hasn't done the math on it according to what you're talking about, right? There's much more effective ways to kill a lot of people.
Oh, absolutely. If you want to kill as many people as possible, then it sounds creepy for me even be saying this, but it's something to contemplate. If you want to kill as many people as possible, then don't use a gun. That's not an intelligent method. That's poor planning. If you are intending to kill as many people as possible and you reach for a gun to do that with, then you have not planned it out well and you're not smart.
Well, right. And in fairness, devil's advocate here, a lot of these situations, people are relying on the fact that a lot of these mass shooters are not people who are thoughtful and prepared. Some of them are, but some of them are just reactionary or attention hungry young folks who, go off the handle and go kill a bunch of people. Mm-hmm. And I think that speaks to maybe one of the broader underlying issues that we may not have time to get into completely tonight, but the overall nihilistic worldview that's become pervasive. It certainly lends a lot to that sort of outburst, because we had an awful lot of guns in years prior, and we did not have an awful lot of high-profile public mass shootings for attention. And so there's a whole lot of other factors that play into that, and of course there's a whole lot of control measures that have been suggested outside of just outright gun bans too. Some of them I think are actually scarier in principle than the gun bans. You get into some real Minority Report nonsense. And by the way, that is not as bitterly opposed by Republicans, which makes it even scarier because that's the type of thing that they could be talked into as well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you brought it up. What bothers me about Republicans is that Republicans are always very proud of being law-abiding. They always they're proud of their military, proud of the police. They pride themselves on being orderly, law-abiding citizens. And so, when you say you're going to do something which targets lawbreakers or which targets bad people more generically, Republicans are often very easy to sway toward that sort of thing because they don't identify themselves with being lawbreakers. Which of course is short-sighted because a lawbreaker can be whoever the government decides is a lawbreaker at the moment. It's not a set in stone thing like people sort of think it is. But
right. So if you look at the national scope and the national picture of what's going on with gun violence, okay, so let's play that that side of it. Not talking about overall violence, we can get into that later. But if you want to narrow it down to gun violence, because this is the game that the left and the anti-gun crowd typically plays, is well, we're going to create a category called gun violence, and then we're going to talk about how bad gun violence is within the category called gun violence, which is, circular and stupid. But where things stand right now, in terms of total gun violence itself is only a fraction of total violence and homicide. And within that, mass shootings are just a very small percentage. And that is not to say, of course, that everyone is not tragic and horrible, and that or to suggest that the lives lost in them are meaningless. It's to give a sense of perspective. And we'll get into a little bit more of why that's important later. But where things stand politically right now, which I think is just as important to the future of this discussion, is that legal precedent in the United States right now is pretty strongly in favor of gun rights. I mean, they would have anyone who's pushing for gun control right now has some significant legal barriers to overcome because things have actually over the course of the past decade or two become more favorable to gun rights. And I think culturally there's just been a broader acceptance. I mean, I've got Bernie bros that are regular shooters that I know. I mean, it's a very cross cultural phenomenon that Americans we like guns. We think they're cool. We also have a Supreme Court that is very likely now to be protective of gun rights, protective of the Heller decision. Obviously, I hesitate to call it a conservative majority, but a lot of people would, that will probably be pretty protective of that. Public opinion also is actually pretty favorable to gun rights in general, but there are some momentary spikes, usually after a mass shooting, where public opinion will change. It was really interesting. There was an Iowa poll lately that came out, of course, again, because of the presidential candidates. They're polling Democratic primary voters up here. And I posted it on Facebook, but I can't remember the polling agency offhand, maybe Monmouth. Regardless, the poll was talking about the priorities of Democratic primary voters or caucus voters here in Iowa. And gun violence was, I think, maybe fifth place, something like that. But during the time that they were polling, which was about a 10-day period, during the last 3 days is when the El Paso shooting happened. And they saw a massive spike in everyone immediately, just overnight, saying, "Oh, now gun violence is, one of my top priorities." And it actually skewed the polling. And they actually had a disclaimer in there about here's where the polling was halfway through, then the shooting happened, and here's where it was afterward. And that just goes to show how easily people are swayed by these kinds of tragedies and by these kinds of high profile incidents that really kind of skew the sense of proportion.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, what that shows is that the people being polled are not basing their answers upon a principle. It shows they haven't really thought about this and weighed their reasons, weighed their pros and cons as to why they would be for or against something like a gun ban or a red flag law. They're just going off of their emotions at the moment. And as I would hope we all know, making decisions based upon your emotions at the moment is a really bad idea. Especially, I mean, I'm thinking now, when I say that, of course, I'm thinking of someone like having an affair, for instance. It's like, oh, well, at the time, I really felt like I was attracted to this person, so we committed adultery, but of course that was the wrong decision and it cost me my job and my marriage and et cetera, et cetera. Um,
Mhm.
so that, and I mean, think about going to a casino, all sorts of other dumb decisions that are based upon feelings of the moment when if you stopped and thought about it with sober judgment, you realize that's not really a very good idea. And when you say that the polling, that gun violence is down to fifth place, and all of a sudden it jumps up to what was it? Was it first, second?
It was, yeah. I mean, it was all averages, right? Because it's polling, but it took a significant jump. I want to say like a 7-point
Yeah.
jump in those 3
And
days.
so what that shows is that people's thinking is not based upon principle. It's not based upon their rational thought about the topic. It's based upon, oh, I feel this right now, so I want to do it. And I tell you,
Mhm.
when we make laws, I mean, laws don't expire when your feelings do. It's like if you make a law to govern something, that law is going to stick around long after your feelings have faded. And so you better not be making laws for, for perpetuity based upon how you feel today.
hmm Yeah, I think the term that we've grown used to hearing now, almost desensitized to, is we have to do something. And if there is one term that one phrase in politics that just grinds my gears and just makes me really afraid of what's coming next, it's that sentiment of we have to do something. Well, no, sometimes you don't. Sometimes you don't, and that's where the debate over thoughts and prayers has come from too. But back to public opinion on guns. So right now, according to numbers from Gallup, 57% of Americans are against an assault weapons ban. 70% are against a handgun ban. Probably the same 70% that don't want to be caught in a situation without one, right? So support for gun control is actually lower than it was in the 90s, and that should tell us something about the direction of it. But that's not to say that the fight is not real, because as we know in America, I mean, obviously, public opinion changes quickly. One election can have dire consequences on any major issue like this. So that's where things stand now. That's not to say that's where they'll be forever. There is a slight majority that's for tighter purchase laws. Do you think that would help, Josh? Why did you see that helping?
No.
Well, why not?
A lot of reasons why not. For one thing, there are. Oh, America, at least Americans love guns, and America is awash in guns. I believe there are actually more guns than there are people in the United States. So if
Open
someone,
borders, fix that.
right? Yes, Joel, that's great. Yes, we need open borders so
We have to do
we need to
something.
get more people than guns in America. It's about time. So let's open those borders up and let the people come so that we can get that ratio where it needs to be.
We
I
have
like
to
it.
do something.
We have to do something.
There's more guns than people.
We have to do something about the number of guns. So we'll let more people in to skew the ratio.
That's
I
right.
like it. I like it. I like your solution.
You heard it here first, folks.
But basically, if someone wants to get a gun in America, you can get a gun. To think that someone has to go through a licensed dealer to get a gun is ridiculous. Do you want? I mean, I don't know have the stats in front of me now, but I know that guns are one of the most commonly stolen items. Um,
hmm
Guns are stolen from gun shops, they're stolen from private homes. If someone breaks into your house to steal, they're probably going to look for your guns because guns are, they're easily transportable, high value item. They're easy to steal.
Right.
Um,
And for the first time in at least for the past few years, we've been able to say for the first time in recent, well, in history, really, you can print a gun.
mhm.
You can print a gun. All you need are plans that are freely available online because nothing ever leaves the internet. Don't be deceived. Nothing ever leaves the internet. So yes, there's all sorts of availability. I don't think can ever be compromised. But the idea that reducing the supply of guns or reducing the pool of people to whom they're available would actually help with the gun violence in America is something that has a pretty broad popular support. Background checks last time I saw were about 93% support. And sometimes I wonder if that's because people have thought it through or if it's just because that seems like the least intrusive thing that's been suggested. And so everybody kind of looks at it and goes, nah, okay, we can do that.
Easy. It's a background
Yeah.
check. That sounds easy. It sounds simple. We can do that. But what good does a background check do? See, the thing is, people who are criminals, people who are career criminals, like stealing is their job. What do you do? What's your what do you do? I steal, or I sell drugs or whatever. People who are professional criminals don't get their guns from they don't walk down to Cabela's.
Walmart.
Yeah, they don't walk down to Cabela's. They don't walk down to Walmart. You know, they don't go down to Gander Mountain and buy themselves a rifle to use in their back alley holdups or whatever they're doing. It's like they're getting their guns illegally, probably by stealing them. Now, people who become these mass shooters, generally, they're people who haven't had previous criminal records. A lot of times, these people who end up becoming mass shooters are people who could or did pass a background check because they don't have a criminal past. And that's one of those things where people who are going to do that, people who I guess have decided to go out this way, they're thinking for whatever reason, you know, whatever evil has gripped their mind, are thinking, I'm going to end my life as a mass shooter. This is the last thing I'm going to do before I either die or go to prison the rest of my life. People have that sort of a snap, that's sort of like I won't say a psychotic break, but that's sort of a corner turned in their mind. There's a finality to that. It's like that's not really probably something you built up to. You probably didn't build up to that sort of a decision through little baby steps of criminality. That's something that you did all at once, and you made a change.
Well, so that's where it's important to draw a distinction, right? Because when people talk about mass shootings, they do a bait and switch. They say mass shootings so that you think of Parkland and Sandy Hook and Columbine. And then they pull out FBI statistics that include gang violence and basically everything where I believe more than 3 people in a single incident are killed, which is
no,
much of the time it's
not are killed, are shot.
Not are killed, are shot. That's right. I apologize.
When
are shot.
When you hear those, and that's where it comes in. 100% of space crimes done by women. When you hear those statistics which say that there are more mass shootings than there are days so far this year, you probably heard that. I saw that on CNN a couple of weeks back. They said there have been more mass shootings this year than there have been days in the year. And they say that because they're calling a mass shooting anytime more than one person was shot, even if nobody died, even if it was gang violence, even if it was a robbery. If more than one person got shot in the same incident, it's a mass shooting, according to those statistics. And that's where they get that from.
I think it's 4 or more.
Is it 4 or more? I might be
just
mistaken.
To be precise, I think according to the FBI, I think it's 4 or more. But you're still talking about a lot of these cases are gang violence, are domestic shootings where somebody walks into their house and, you know, caps their significant other and couple of kids, which happens disturbingly often.
And also, it doesn't imply fatality. It can be a quote-unquote mass shooting when nobody died.
Yeah. Yep. So, I mean, you have to look at these types of things. And that's why I get so frustrated sometimes with what I feel like is the dishonesty around these statistics. And it's not just on this issue, obviously. I mean, we've talked about before how dishonest statistics are used in immigration, how we, you know, artificially reduce the scope of the question in order to get the answers that we want. I mean, there's a whole lot of ways that people are dishonest to grab power, and guns are no exception. But I want to go back to something that we had mentioned earlier in terms of just the balance of kind of freedom and security on this. And that's a central theme throughout American history, right? But there was a discussion that I saw one time on YouTube. If you're interested in looking at it, there's an exchange between Milton Friedman, the economist Milton Friedman, and a young Michael Moore, who asks Friedman about a car manufacturer who produced a faulty car. People got hurt, or there was liability involved, and he basically was asking, shouldn't these car manufacturers be held accountable for producing faulty equipment? And where Milton Friedman came back on the specific question of, you know, manufacturers and legal liability aside, he introduced the broader question behind it by saying, hey, so people knew these cars were unsafe and they bought them. Is that because they made a cost benefit and a risk analysis under which the purchase of this car was still favorable, and then they willingly accepted that risk and came out on the short end of it? Why is that the manufacturer's fault? And it applies to this because everything in our lives is that sort of a cost benefit equation. Everything is a calculation of what is acceptable risk to us. And I face this in my job in IT. There's always an acceptable level of risk with a program or with software. And it's the same thing in our personal and in our corporate decisions as Americans. I mean, these are the types of things that come up. We could pay $1 million for a car and it would be perfectly safe. You could pay $1 million for a car and you could have 10 feet of rubber bumpers on every side and it could never go more than 4 miles an hour, and you could make it perfectly safe. But it would not be within the range of most people. It would fail just about all the other function that we need from it. And I think that's kind of the key here, is at what cost. And that's when you get into people saying we have to do something, the natural follow-up should be at what cost.
Well, I remember I saw a movie once about a society in which everyone lived in perfect physical safety from birth to death. People were born and they lived a life completely free from injury, completely free from any sort of physical danger, up until the point where they died in a peaceful and medically sterile setting. That movie was The Matrix. And I'm, of course, referring to the people in the gooey Matrix pods in the power plant. I'm assuming that our listeners here have seen The Matrix. And if you recall, you have these little babies which are grown in these artificial wombs, and then they are stuck into these pods covered in goop, and they live their entire life inside that pod until eventually, they die. So you're talking about risk versus freedom. And if you want to live in a society in which there is no risk, if you want to live in a society in which you have perfect physical safety all the time, that's it. You want to live in a matrix pod, and that's the only way you're going to have that. And if you don't want to live in a matrix pod where you are surrounded by goop and never leave it, then you have to accept some sort of risk.
Right. And so, when to bring it to a point on guns, if we were to eliminate all risk, is it worth the cost? Should we disarm everyone in America to save one child? Because that's the implication when people say, well, we have to do whatever we can do. And if it saves one person, then it's worth it. Is it though?
No.
I mean,
of course not.
This is the central question, right? This is the central question of firearm ownership and of the freedom versus security debate in general. Like, how about 100 children? What is that number? How many people have to be saved in order to justify disarming everyone?
Well, first of all, that's definitely a valid argument. But before you have that, consider that question, you have to ask, does it actually do what it's supposed to do? Does removing guns from a society actually reduce violence? Does it actually save any children? And if you look at statistics, the answer is no, it doesn't. So I'm going to talk, you've probably heard, Joel, you've probably heard people mention Australia as an example of successful gun control.
Well, yes. Also adept knife wielding.
Yes. Well, yeah, it's the knife crime is become an epidemic in London, England, where they don't have guns, so people use knives to kill each other and slice each other up because, like I said, violence was not invented in the 1600s when portable firearms were invented. Violence has always been with us, and people will kill each other with whatever weapons they have available. If you take away the guns, well, they'll probably use something else, because taking away people's guns does not make them good, does not make them mentally stable or whatever. But gun violence in Australia. Australia had a more or less total ban on privately owned firearms back in 1996. There was a mass shooting in Australia around that time, and they had a knee-jerk emotional reaction to it and said, okay, well, no more private firearms in Australia unless you have some special reason why you need one. You gotta have a special license for it. But so Australia was more or less disarmed in 1996 and the years following. And if you look at the murder rate in Australia, did their rate of violence decrease after 1996? Well, the answer is yes. And people will use that statistic to try and prove that, well, gun bans work. They took away the guns in Australia, the violence went down. The thing is, and we'll post links to these graphs in the show notes. The thing is, if you look at the violence rate in the United States at the same time, it was also decreasing. In fact, the overall rate of violence has been decreasing since let me see here, let me get my little graph out. The mid-90s. Violence peaked in, violence peaked in the early 90s, late 80s, and has been decreasing steadily ever since. And that trend has been in the United States, has been in England. Basically, the entire English-speaking world has seen a general decrease in violence over the course of the past 30 years. So Australia saw that, but so did America. And America, if you might recall, there was an assault weapons ban that Bill Clinton had signed back when he was president. And that ban actually expired during the time period since the Australian gun ban, and the number of firearms purchased by Americans has continued to increase in the years since the gun ban. But our violence in America, our rate of murder, has decreased at about the same rate as the Australian rate of violence has during the same time period. So when people produce that stat and say, look, they banned guns in Australia and the violence went down, well, yeah, it did, but it did in America too. So obviously that wasn't the cause.
Right. And I think, going back to the kind of the jarring emotional reactionism that we talk about a lot, it's kind of the same thing here as it is when people talk about, mistreatment of animals, or you remember, I don't
Not
know
a
if you
puppy.
did you see the did you see the controversy about the Jimmy John's guy last week?
No.
So the owner of Jimmy John's apparently went on a safari, shot an elephant, and sparked a boycott of Jimmy John's because people are out there saying, "How could you kill this beautiful animal?" And look, I'm not a fan of trophy hunting. I think if you're going to kill it, you need to eat it. But at the same time, they're boycotting Jimmy John's, and I'm like, do you realize what's in a Jimmy John's sub?
I think pigs are
realize
cute.
this.
Some pigs are cute little things. I mean,
Exactly. But the point is the people that go down that road, they're like, animals are beautiful and need to be protected and all this when they're looking into the eyes, of a puppy dog and watching again we often reference the Sarah McLachlan ad, right? Like it yes, that makes you feel sad and it makes you think this way, but you don't mind swatting the mosquito on your neck without a second thought. But there's no logical difference between the two of them. Or if you want to take it down another level, the million microbes you killed just by breathing today. So like there's all sorts of inconsistencies there. And in the same way, people get crazy about mass shootings and gun violence as if it's the only one that matters. Or my favorite one is the distinction between, well, I'm not talking about homicides because you can bring up the fact that homicides have been dropping for years and years now.
About
And they'll
half
say,
what
well,
they were 30 years ago.
Right. And so it's like they'll say, I'm not talking about homicides. I'm talking about mass shootings. And I just kind of go, well, is it better to die in a one-on-one shooting than in a shooting of 1-on-20? Like what's the value difference here? Why are you drawing a distinction between a bunch of people in a room in one place and 20 different people being shot in 20 different places? Does it make a difference?
It's a sociological difference.
Not to Hillary Clinton it, but right, for sociological reasons. But in overall terms of violence and aggregates, no, it doesn't make a difference. The lives are just as valuable. So having a gun that's, is it better to have 10 handguns with one shot each or one rifle with 50 shots? What?
Well, the thing is, I mean, and again, it's morbid to think this way, but you need to think this way to discuss the issue. The thing with these mass shootings, it's not the fact that the shooter had some sort of an awesome gun. He didn't go in there with a minigun that shoots 1,000 rounds a minute and mow down a bunch of people. These mass shooters are not able to claim a large number of victims because their gun is so powerful. They're able to claim a large number of victims because their victims are helpless and unable to fight back. Mm-hmm. Remember there was a shooting in Virginia Tech a couple years back. I think it was 2007. But the Virginia Tech shooter, I think he killed over 30 people, and he killed them with a Glock 9mm and a 22 caliber pistol. So the thing is, these huge numbers of victims don't happen because the weapons are so powerful. They happen because the people are helpless. And if your victims are helpless, it doesn't matter what kind of gun you have. If I'm going to go and kill a bunch of people who have no weapons, who are trapped, who are afraid, it doesn't matter what I have because the power is mine if I have anything. And it's just, so back to the question, we talk about what's the number? How many children do we need to save before it's worth banning these things? And again, the answer is that doesn't save children anyway. It doesn't make a difference. These statistics don't bear it out. The statistics do not show that reducing the number of guns makes any difference to the amount of violence. And if you just think about it logically, it doesn't even make sense to think that we could save people by taking away this one particular weapon because it's not the relevant factor.
Well, right, and the fact that, as you brought up, this tends to be only addressed in the context of aggression with firearms. We don't ever talk about defensive use of firearms, which is actually a really important thing to talk about. Now, in 2013, the CDC put out a study that included defensive use of firearms, and the quote from there is as follows, quote, "Almost all national survey estimates indicate that defensive gun uses by victims are at least as common as offensive uses by criminals, with estimates of annual uses ranging from about 500,000, annually by the way, to more than 3 million in the context of about 300,000 violent crimes involving firearms in 2008. So old data, yes, because they mostly stopped asking that question, but this was from the CDC. Not exactly it's not exactly Breitbart we're talking about here, and they estimate 500,000 to 3 million defensive use of firearms per year. So when you look at it from that perspective, defensive as well as aggressive, it starts to balance out. And but to me, I don't like the pragmatic arguments. Usually, I don't like them as often as as much as the principled arguments, because at the end of the day, if there's a 90% homicide rate in America, that has no bearing on me and my gun if I'm not doing it. If my gun is not killing anybody and I'm using mine defensively for good, it doesn't matter how many other people are involved in these crimes, because I have nothing to do with them. I am not enabling them. I am not empowering them. I am defending against them. And so the prevalence of gun violence, to me, no matter how prevalent it is, really doesn't justify infringing upon the right of self-defense that was really the principle behind the Second Amendment itself, right?
Mhm.
I mean, I just don't see how those things are connected at all. And that's, to me, the logical leap that I can't justify. And it's hard to take anybody seriously when they start going there, because it's not just a national discussion of cost benefit. There's also the individual element that we really cannot afford to overlook in these discussions, because me and my family will be protected. We will be protected. So this is our means to defend ourselves. And I think that we can't leave that out of the discussion on guns.
No. Well, you talk about self-defense. Self-defense, of course, is an important reason to own a gun, but in my mind, there are a lot of good reasons for people to own guns. And I'm just going to say this, maybe I make you sound crazy, but I love guns. I do.
I think we knew
Yeah.
that, Josh.
I love guns. But the reason I love guns...
We'll put a poll up online about that later. How many of you knew that before Josh said
How
it?
many knew? Yeah. How many of you suspected his secret? But the reason I love guns, Joel, it's not... I mean, guns are cool. Well, sure they are. But I mean, I love guns because I think that an armed society is a wholesome society. And there are a couple of reasons for that. First of all, think of what it means to a society if we say no guns here. Joel, if I say to you, you may not have a gun, I'm going to send the police to take away your gun, make sure you don't have it. That says more clearly and more strongly than any words could ever say that I don't trust you. If I don't think you should have a gun, that means I don't trust you. It means I'm afraid of you, Joel. I'm afraid you're going to hurt me. And if I say that to all of my neighbors, if my neighbors and I all get together, we make a policy, none of us can have guns, that means we don't trust each other. That means each of us is afraid that each of the other ones is going to come get us, and we have to take preemptive action to disarm our neighbors to make sure they don't hurt us. And when you start out with that, you end up with a society that is paranoid, where people don't trust each other, people don't like each other. You know what? My neighbors here, I live in Texas, my neighbors have guns, and I like that. When I see someone who is carrying or know they're carrying a gun, or I see them with their gun, or just know they have a gun, that makes me feel safe and secure, because that shows me that we live in a neighborhood, we live in a society where these people all trust each other. I trust you to have a gun, you trust me to have a gun. And moreover, we have this trust in our mutual defense. It's like, I know we all trust each other, and if there's trouble, we can count on each other for mutual assistance. And if you ban guns and we say to each other, I don't trust any of y'all to have a gun, that's gone.
Mm-hmm. So let me go devil's advocate here then, okay? Would you trust your neighbors each to have a nuke?
I don't... That's complicated, man. See, okay, people always bring up that argument, and do you want to go down that rabbit hole? Because I know it comes up.
Yeah. I mean, if you can throw a reaction at it, because this is we try to reach a broad audience here. There's going to be folks for whom that's the natural response is, okay, well, how far can you logically extend that thought? Should we each have, do you trust your neighbor with attack helicopters? And I mean, I've got some neighbors around here that, I have questions about, and people, sometimes go through rough times in their life. They get on drugs. They have all sorts of things happen. Do you want somebody like that with their hands on the means to destroy, a skyscraper?
Okay, well, again, I have a practical answer to that. My answer is that I don't think it makes any difference. How much does a nuke cost, Joel? millions of dollars, billions of dollars.
Well, Amazon hasn't reminded me lately, so I'm not sure.
Yeah, I haven't.
After this conversation, it'll pop up on my phone, guaranteed.
Yeah. Yes, thank you, Alexa. I haven't looked it up, but I'm guessing new nukes are really expensive. So you say, well, should my neighbor be allowed to have a nuke? Is your neighbor a millionaire? And if your neighbor is a millionaire, is he an idiot who's going to waste his money on a nuke that he can never use for a legitimate purpose? Probably not. So people ask that question. They say, well,
tread carefully, you tread on my dreams.
Well, I wouldn't want a nuke. What would I do with a nuke? Why on earth would I want to have a nuke? And I figure the people who would actually want to have a nuke are probably not going to have the means to acquire one because they're not going to be millionaires. There are, as far as who can use a gun is useful for my personal defense. I can defend myself, I can defend my family, I can defend my community with my gun. What can you use a nuke for? You can use a nuke either for war with other countries. Well, you could microwave food out, I guess, if you like expose the core and like anyway. But what's a nuke good for? A nuke is good for I can make war with other countries, or you can commit acts of terrorism. And in either of those cases, the question doesn't matter. And that's the case with all of these kind of weapons. Should my neighbor be allowed to have an attack helicopter? Well, if my neighbor has enough money to afford an attack helicopter and they have the malice to destroy their neighbors, then it doesn't matter if they can have one or not. Because like Timothy McVeigh, they can use a truck. They can hijack an airplane. They can use some other method where they can put those same resources to use to destroy in some other way. So I think the question is foolish. It's, should my neighbor be allowed to have a nuke? Well, it doesn't bother me because my neighbor's not going to get a nuke because they can't afford one. And if they can afford one, then they're going to be smart enough not to need one. It's just silly. It's a silly scenario. So I guess my answer to that, should my neighbor be allowed to have a nuke? I'm like, sure. Because it's an economic problem that solves itself. We don't need to worry about it. That's my answer.
Fair enough. Just wanted to get that out of the way.
Well, it's brought up a lot. People always say that. It's like people should be allowed to have, guns with 15 round magazines. Well, should they be allowed to have a nuke? What's the next step? Oh, it's like, but that's not something I worry about.
Yeah, I hear you. And I kind of worry about, it's not a worry about, but I feel like this discussion won't potentially be guns for too much longer because, as you said, as technology improves, we find more effective ways to kill each other. And, in the era of drones and nanotech, I don't think it's necessarily going to be too much longer before guns are very obsolete. It might be nation states at first, but almost anything that you can get, on a nation state level, you can also find a way to get outside of that. So, how much longer before guns really aren't the preferred method anymore because guns are noisy and messy and attract a lot of attention from law enforcement and all these other things that maybe, anthrax doesn't. Maybe, biological agents, maybe nanotech, maybe, all sorts of things like that. There's all sorts of other ways to do this that as we become more technologically advanced and complex, will I think become the future. And that's where I think there's also kind of a jarring inconsistency for me when people start hand-wringing about gun violence. A lot of times it comes from these elite folks in DC and Hollywood, and they just tearfully, rail on gun violence and, it's so awful. We have a gun violence problem and there's, school shootings and all this stuff. And it is terrible. I don't want to mock that. But at the same time that they're saying that, they're raking in cash from these, gun-packed action movies, and they keep their own armed security guards. And, Joe Biden's out here. Gun violence is a terrible thing at the Iowa State Fair, and he's got, 12 Secret Service guys behind him, And so it's just a little bit hard to take. They're piling the hypocrisy on pretty thick with that. But in pointing out that inconsistency, I'm not saying that I want them to stop making action-packed gun movies. I'm just saying that the actions are conflicting, and that those conflicting actions are actually sort of an acknowledgement of the depth and resolve of American gun culture. So even while they're saying we shouldn't be like this, they're capitalizing on it because they don't expect it to change. They don't think it's going to. And I think that's probably with good reason. I mean, Americans love guns. I do too. You said you love guns. I love them. I think they're great. I like cars. I like all sorts of big, powerful machines. It's wired into me. In our nation, I mean, America is a little bit unique in this. And if you talk to people like international folks, they'll tell you how unique this actually is. A lot of folks who come from countries that don't allow them are just terrified of guns. Like I don't know. I feel like if I'm in a room with one, it will jump up and get me. That sort of thing. But we're different here. Our nation was basically born of an armed revolt against a tyrannical monarch and a world military power. So it makes sense that we would have that culture. But there's also sort of a glamour element, right? I mean, I don't, maybe you didn't. I was a sheltered homeschool kid, but I still grew up watching, the Terminator and playing Call of Duty and loving it, and Halo, and picking up guns and being like, hey, this is how I'm going to save the day. I'm going to go save the universe with a gun.
Mhm.
And it doesn't make a lot of sense if you think about it critically sometimes.
Doesn't it,
but
though? I mean, that's the noble warrior who saves the world is a trope from all cultures, mythologies, and stories. And that makes perfect sense.
yeah, but a giant laser sword, I mean, was kind of cooler,
Well, I mean,
right?
yeah, that's cool. I mean, it depends on if you can on your distance, but but you bring up video games, and every time this sort of thing happens too, it's like video games get brought up, and like violent video games or murder
Ugh.
simulators, and kids are learning to kill at a young age, and blah 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 blah. But like you brought up, you talking about like playing Halo or Call of Duty. Um, is violence a bad thing of itself? And we say the answer obviously is no, because we know that violence can be used to defend the innocent, to defend life, to defend society. And all cultures, ours is certainly no exception, all cultures of history have loved stories about these noble warriors who use violence, who use weapons to defend their cities, their cultures, their honor. And if I have a video game like Halo, I mean, what do you do in Halo? In Halo, you pick up a gun and you are destroying evil aliens in order to save humanity. And like, how does I'm sorry, how does that teach me to do anything evil? How does picking up fantasizing, going through the science fiction fantasy where I am a hero who saves humanity from aggressors, how does that teach me to be violent toward anybody? It doesn't. It's the opposite. It teaches me that I need to protect people. I need to protect the innocent. I need to value human life, and that's what's being demonstrated there.
Mhm.
Of course, that's not the case in all
Well,
games, but
yeah. Well, so for anybody keeping score, within the last 2 weeks, Josh has now asked if bullying is a good thing, if violence is a good thing, and if we should legalize nukes. So if there are any red flag laws coming down the pipe, you can guarantee that Josh Hugo is going to be at the top of that list, and I probably won't be far behind. Folks, thanks for tuning in tonight. That's all we have time for, but we want to find out what you think about the gun debate, and do you think there's a valid case to be made, maybe for background checks, if you're one of the 93% of Americans that agree with that. We want to hear from you. We want to know why. If not, we want to know that too. So make sure you give us a follow on social media, and we will find you next time here on Constructive Interference.